how things were. This is our land. He left it to us. He delivered the papers, signed by his hand. The will and testament is housed in Quito, the deed in Popayan. Later, this place became a reservation, the property of the Indian. This land, from the Patascoy volcano to the Tortuga, from Doña Juana to, what is the name of that river? It borders on Los Laboneros. The people of this place are the owners, the true owners. The people of this place didn't know how to hold it. But Carlos Tumabihoy provided for us. Because we didn't heed him, we have been thrown off our own land. That's why a missionary father said to me, what if you people had said, 5 days, fair warning, and the white people are gone? Because here there is a law. But due to our ignorance, they have robbed us of our land. And we, the true owners, And the will resides in Quito, the deed in Popayan. Taita Bautista's performance was an affecting one, in part due to the solemnity of tone, but also due to stylistic formulation of the discourse, palpable in the move towards highly structured speech. This legend could easily be formatted as a poem, and in the realization of the missionary's query as a quoted speech, occasioning a breakthrough from the propositional mode of narrative to the mode of dramatic enactment. Taita Bautista's litany-like delivery and mimetic rendering of dialogue drive home the message of bitter dispossession. Territorio Ancestral Carlos Tumabihoy. As prominent as Carlos Tumabihoy was in these oral histories and mythic narratives, I could not have predicted his emergence in today's political discourse as the embodiment of indigenous identity. The children and grandchildren of my acquaintances from the 1970s into the 1990s have adopted Carlos Tumabihoy in an ethno-political movement arising in a moment of cultural and environmental precarity, as multiple development projects threaten the quality of life in the Sibundoy Valley and its vertical extensions into the middle and lower Putumayo. There are always dogs in the Sibundoy Valley, so it's interesting. Did I just hear one?
Eco-performative.
Yes, this powerful stuff. These threats and a general concern that the indigenous cultures are in danger of disappearing altogether under the pressures of rapid modernization have motivated these younger generations to spearhead a program of ethnic resistance that has taken the form of mass mobilizations on the one hand and legalistic wrangling with local, state, and national authorities on the other. Contrary to what is often supposed, that tradition is an albatross hindering native and indigenous peoples from coping with the forces of modernity, what we see in Colombia's Sibundoy Valley is the strategic deployment of tradition to project a distinctive ethnic persona and to rally community members to take political action. At the heart of this emerging political ideology is the figure of Carlos Tumabihoy, the legendary cacique who secured the land for the people. Juan Carlos Hakanamihoy Huahibihoy, the son of my old companion Juan Huahibihoy, offers a sober appraisal of the situation in the Sibundoy Valley today. And I can't resist showing you this picture I took many years ago when my old friend Juan Huahibihoy was, he got his high school diploma in the town of Sibundoy, and he dressed in his traditional indigenous clothing. But back to Juan's son, Juan Carlos. Juan Carlos describes Carlos Tumabihoy in these terms. He has been an icon in the defense of territorial rights since the times of the great-grandfathers to the present day. Juan Carlos refers to a number of pressing dangers: the locomotora minera, or industrial mining operations, a road-building project known as Proyecto Irsa that would trespass sacred lands and create ecological problems, and licenses granted to the authorities granted by the authorities to Anglo-Gold Ashanti Mokoa ventures that could further erode the lifeways of the Sibundoy peoples. Juan Carlos takes heart in the resistance of his community, stating that, and I quote him, "Our path to defend our territorial rights has been made with the Inga and Kamsa fathers and mothers, with the strength of the young people and the hopes of the children," end quote. He then repeats to me the ubiquitous slogan of the Sibundoy movement, "Por la tierra, por la vida, por nuestra existencia," for the land, for life, for our existence. We see in formulations such as this the strategic use of indigenous tradition, an irreplaceable resource for community empowerment, lodged in a timeless eternity, yet adaptable to the needs of the moment. This discourse of ethnic political engagement is marshaled in the movilizaciones, the mobilizations or community gatherings and marches, and other protest actions carried out in the Sibundoy Valley, often conceived as mingas, that is, collective efforts to defend the territory, drawing on the historic and widespread Andean custom of communal labor. Here's an image of one of the movilizaciones, a march across the perimeter of the Sibundoy Valley. Community media collectives such as Colectivo de Comunicaciones Tamabioy, that would be the Communications Collective Tamabioy, located in the Sibundoy Valley, produce and circulate via YouTube informative video documentaries of these civic actions, featuring, for example, the June 26, 2010 Movilización and the March 13, 2015 Minga por Defensa del Territorio. These political actions occur under the aegis of the Territorio Ancestral de Carlos Tamabioy, and like the political manifestos emerging from the Sibundoy Valley, they are replete with an ethnopolitical rhetoric drawing on traditional expressive resources of the community. Sibundoy eco-spirituality resides at the core of a claim to ecosystem custody that could be characterized as a form of eco-sovereignty, a term I introduce here to capture the Sibundoy affirmation of their territorio ancestral, their ancestral territory. This ideological construction bespeaks a privileged placement in a spiritualized landscape with a concomitant responsibility to nurture and protect that natural heritage. As one manifesto proclaims, and I quote from it, "We are protectors of life and guardians of the earth. This is a duty and natural law inherited from our ancestors for our future generations and humanity." End of quote. The Sibundoy protest movement is directed to protecting the region from the depredations of large-scale capitalistic development projects with their devastating impacts on land and lifeways, and it exhibits a deep articulation of eco-spirituality, a sense of spiritual presence in the landscape and its flora and fauna. In the discourse of ecological protest, Sibundoy voices align themselves with the natural elements. One slogan you hear is, "Somos agua, somos tierra." We are water, we are earth. And proclaim a visceral identification with the sacralized land through use of the slogan, "Putumayo son mis entrañas, vida." I don't know how to translate that. "Putumayo son mis entrañas, vida." Putumayo, my guts are life. Something along those lines. This discourse features both a feminine and a masculine spiritual core. A handcrafted banner for the June 2010 mobilization reads as follows, and you can see it here. Translated, the banner says, "We defend the earth because she gave us life, and she gives us the water and the plants." This banner is carried by women marchers, and it includes visual motifs that derive from the local weaving tradition, a tradition that is practiced exclusively by women in the Sibundoy Valley. One of these motifs is a visual representation of the river. You can see that on the lower corner there of that banner. The other is called Tkantema in Kamsa, thought of as a representation of a little flower. This banner expresses in simple terms two themes that are pervasive in the ecological dimension of protest: the personification of the earth as a beneficent spiritual presence, and the strong association of the earth with feminine attributes. a couple more of the posters and political productions that I've come across. I won't take time to go into them. Other than, this is kind of interesting, the slogan at the top of this one. Of course, you see Cacique Carlos Camabioy in all of this material. But this fortaleciendo las huellas de nuestros antepasados, strengthening the tracks, the footprints of our ancestors. And a very important phrase in the ritual language, the ritual communication in these communities as we are following in the footsteps of our ancestors. So they picked that phrase up and they've sort of reconditioned it and placed it prominently in products like this one. Sibundoy eco-sovereignty features this connection to the land personified as a nurturing mother. Bungabe Spadnana Mama, our Mother Earth in Kamsa, and Nukanchi Alpa Mama, our Mother Earth in Inga, assimilated in the contemporary moment to Pachamama, the Pan-Andean goddess of earthly feminine power, and this is further tied to the initially Andean but now global concept of Sumak Kausai, that is, life lived in harmony with nature and the ancestors. The masculine element that is prominent in this discourse revolves around the work of the native doctors, the spiritual guardians of the community, most of whom are men, in their role as intermediaries with the spirit world. The visual artifacts in current Sibundoy protest feature images of the native doctors, foregrounding in particular their feather headdresses, and you can see an example of this in the sketch done by an artist in the Sibundoy Valley. And these feather headdresses that signify a connection to the bird deities that are so prominent in Sibundoy mythology. Sibundoy native doctors, known familiarly as the Taitas, that is the fathers, are today conservators of traditional knowledge, specializing in connectivity with a spiritualized nature and renowned for a botanical science centered on the medicinal plants, the medicinal uses of plants found in and cultivated in the environs of the valley. They are the most direct link to the exemplary ancestors, and they are the conservators of their millennial heritage. Tellingly, the protest gatherings in the Sibundoy Valley feature groups of Taitas performing cleansing rituals, manifesting their customary ritual formulas and practices, and fulfilling their traditional role as protectors of the community. So I'm getting very close to finishing. I thought it would be interesting to share one of the products of the colectivos, the communication groups that are creating mediated communications. So let's see if we're able to convince the, it looks promising.
Юсарета, Ютата, Майсуде, Ювижата, Ювижата Женихали, Юстри, Мама, Юнайна Жарева, Татья Кали, Памривали, Тася Ежея, Танивацика Тажгури, Тамас Пальсика, Тася Евия, Девота Татуата, Дита, Натавасницы, Такая,
You're not singing.
No! You're not measuring me. Really good. The people in money, they made it in Obama. Vampires.
Turn it around, but it's all connected though. I was seeing it.
Oh.
Why didn't you say something?
We thought we were just supposed to listen.
The music was great.
I want to talk about that music, but I'm going to wrap things up here in a minute. Well, while Carlos sorts out the technology here, let me just briefly conclude. And we can, when you find it, we can put it up at the very end.
There it is.
Yeah. Do you have it?
It's sure.
Okay, let's do it then.
In theory.
you can see it's a pretty sophisticated production. It's not, at least it's not, you know, sort of something that I would do. So they've got something going there. If possible, let's see if it's kind of interesting. So they do a series of testimonies. We can maybe listen to a little bit of that.
Somos fuego, somos tierra, somos Putumayo.
Somos de la vida y para la vida.
So it ends with this interesting note here. The Cabildos all sent a message saying that they were against this mining project, but the authorities did not accept that, so things are still in the air. And so it's interesting here, they declare themselves in permanent Minga. You'll see it here in a second. Por eso seguimos en Minga, por la vida del Putumayo. So because of that, we continue in this state of collective labor for the life of our territory, which is the Putumayo region. All right, let me conclude. This is a brief, so just about done. These Andean instances of eco-performativity in the north of Ecuador and the south of Colombia manifest a pattern of deeply rooted indigenous tradition reformulated as a praxis of ethnic resistance in the face of destructive projects tied to encroaching modernity. I see these case studies as representative of a larger and in fact global phenomenon, the use of eco-performative discourse in speech forms, in musical performances, in visual imagery and bodily attire and decor, in festive and ritual events, to effectively engage the forces of modernity. Drawing on Speech Act theory, I have advanced the concept of eco-performativity to assess the impact of strategic vernacular discourse in settings that are productive of ecological trauma. When discourse trained on ecological concerns is felicitous, that is, when it is executed by the right persons in the right venues, when it is resonant with deeply held beliefs, and when it is rendered in stylized performances, it can empower people to respond to the personal and collective trauma associated with environmental crises. Eco-performative discourse that is employed in local settings and broadcast outwards into wider communicative networks must be recognized as consequential in the current struggle over the fate of the planet and life upon it in this age of ecological precarity. Thank you.
So thank you for clapping so vigorously, eco-performatively bringing the lights back on. Would you be able to maybe call upon and your own people who might like to address? You might also say that we do have, as you can see, after we finish the questions and answers, please do hang around a bit. We have some wine and some reception for you. So if I said that'd be okay?
Yeah, and I'd like to give a shout out to my students who are here, quite a few of you. Good to see you people. I can't believe you don't get enough of me Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, but and some family members. It's really fun to see some of my siblings and some new friends like Stanley. But yeah, I don't want to keep us from the wine very long, but if a couple of you have questions, I'd be happy to respond. Stanley, and then.
Well, thank you for a really well-constructed and informative talk.
Thanks.
Very, very interesting and also well-written in the portions you read.
Thank you.
I'm interested to know more about the way these people support themselves economically, and it's kind of heroic of them to protest the coming of this mine when it would provide an alternative form of subsistence for them.
Yeah.
That's one question. And the other one is, are there migrants from this community that have gone elsewhere? And what is their relationship to the people? And are they doing anything to contribute to the protest movement? And one more very small question. All these placards, posters, and so forth are principally written in Spanish, which to me, from the Mexican experiences, is unusual in that indigenous groups would be at least having translations of all this in their own language as a way of communicating their separate identity.
3 wonderful questions. You all have an hour? No, let me just briefly address them. They're very, very interesting points, each of them. So in terms of the use of language, so maybe I'll do them in reverse order. In the clip that I showed a few segments of, a number of the testimonies that take place are in Inga or Kamsa. So the languages are there. It's true in the visual and the banners and so forth, we're mostly seeing Spanish. It is a community where there's a transition going on as far as language use is concerned. When I was there, the language of the family, of the community, was the indigenous language, whether it be the Ingas or the Kamsa. But, you know, there's a really important factor, which is generational transmission. And what is happening there, and also in the Otavalo area and down in Ecuador, is that the younger people, they go through a kind of a phase where they understand the native language but don't use it very much. And then there are some families in these communities where the generations that are coming up really don't know the language. So language preservation is a major issue. But there's enough of in the Sibundoy Valley, there's enough of the 2 indigenous languages that they play more than just a decorative role. They are significantly involved in this protest discourse. So the second question about there are major diasporas of these communities. I'm thinking now probably more people live outside of the Sibundoy Valley. They go to Pasto, which is the nearby city. They go to Cali up the way. They go to Bogota, Medellin. They go to, well, they used to go to Venezuela. They used to go to Venezuela. Now some of them are coming back from Venezuela. So in fact, they're establishing cabildos, tribal councils, in all of the cities I mentioned. They have a tribal council in San Jose, Costa Rica. So it is, even the Sibundoy populations are responding to market forces, young people going away to college or looking for employment and so forth. So we are seeing that, but they do maintain a relationship and they try to come back to the valley for carnival. They have a very well-known and very important carnival celebration in the Sibundoy Valley. Of course, the Otavaleños have been famous for traveling around the world since forever. So that's been a mobile community since the time of the Incas, probably, something like that. Yeah, and as for your first question, you know, I don't know much about that side of it. One imagines, this is the way I think it might work out. In the towns in the Sibundoy Valley, there are settler populations who are not indigenous. I'm just going to guess, and I really don't have direct information, that some of those folks are probably in favor of these development projects for the reasons you mentioned, bringing money into the area. And there's often a kind of a standoff between the indigenous communities and the settler, the mestizo communities in these areas historically. So I think that might be playing out in this case as well. That's a speculation. I'd have to go and verify it. But yeah, good questions. Yeah. Wait a minute. Nelson was next, and then this. Yeah.
Maybe it's a little follow-on, but these days I'm just wondering if this is globalized or known globally, because media pick up on these things, and allies with similar problems elsewhere want to get together. I've worked with the Inuit who are in alliance with Mayans about climate warming, global warming, and pollution from the atmosphere and so on. Is anything like that happening?
I'm so glad you asked that, because
you're part of it, of course.
Yeah, well, I mean, people talk to people, right, all over the place. But my sister Moore says something about great music, and this is really very interesting. The musical clip, I don't have time. I have the link, but we're going to get to wine very soon. But the musical soundtrack for the Putumayo display they do comes out of an indigenous collective in San Luis Potosí, Mexico. And it's essentially Huichol. It's Huichol, and it has to do with the trip to Huiracuta, to the sacred land of the peyote. So they're that's a manifestation of what you're talking about, an awareness on the part of marginalized communities of native and indigenous peoples, really all over the world, sort of forming being a kind of a solidarity. And one of the places we saw that was in the Dakota pipeline protests, where indigenous and marginalized peoples from all over the world, not just the Americas, but the Sami people sent a delegation over. So this is a phenomenon that's quite remarkable, and there really is this sense of connectivity between these communities that are sort of on the margins of the national
They can
society.
give each other strength.
And they do. They really do. I think they find
They're
sustenance.
probably facing the same foe, like Anglo-American everywhere.
You know, Anglo-American sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? Yeah, question over here.
I guess I'm curious about, I don't know, the people around there in the park, how much of an influence, especially the Civil War, has had on the community,
Yeah.
or if it's not something that's been felt.
Yeah, so that the Sibundoy Valley and more generally the Putumayo region of Colombia was kind of a crossroads during the Civil War. It was a place where the army would come in, and then the army would leave, and then the FARC would come in. So people were really caught kind of in the middle of a quarrel that wasn't theirs, I think. That was the sense I got from the people I talked to. They were fortunate in that they weren't far enough off the beaten track. There's some areas in Colombia where terrible massacres and so forth occurred. And there, to my knowledge, there wasn't that level of violence. There was violence, but not the kind of thing that really that you read about and is just horrific. But they were, and it's one of those things. When I was first going down there, I would wander around any time of day or night. But now, when we go back there, you have to be in your house by sundown. There's just not, things have changed in the aftermath of what you're talking about.
Are there still soldiers walking around?
So the soldier presence has reduced to probably very, very little now. But I would say when we were back there not long ago, was about 10 years ago, I'm thinking to that trip, there was some presence of military, but not like the whole place being cordoned or anything like that. Yes?
And then Charles behind you. So I have two questions. One is related to Nelson's. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about audiences and maybe immediate and then more indirect audiences, like the connectivity and so on. I'm wondering if there are they trying to get local media coverage? So they'll go on national television, for example. Are they doing some of these performances, certainly for themselves, but also for a non-native population in the area? So what other audiences are happening?
Yeah.
And then the other question I had, which is also related, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about this media collective. Are some of these people, where do they get their training? Where do they get the financing for that? And they're doing pretty sophisticated work. Are they, have they gone to university, or do they have an NGO working with them? How does that collective work? And do they have community radio?
Community radio. A nice set of questions. Probably good ingredients for my next research proposal. In other words, I can't give you much to go on there. I can just say a few things. The audiences. So my sense of it right now is the primary audience is internal community people. That's my sense of it. However, I also know that they do make an effort to connect. For example, they have ties to some of the newspapers and radio programs in Pasto, which isn't too far away. So there are some efforts that are made. And another set of connections they have are to outfits like Cultural Survival and some kinds of NGOs that are taking an interest in what's happening in Colombia. So So that's something to really look into. In terms of how exactly how these collectives operate, I would like to know more about it. I can say something about radio, and this takes us down to Ecuador. There's a radio station called Radio Iluman, which is an indigenous run station. I think it's financed by some kind of an outfit out of the Scandinavian countries. I don't remember the details. And when we went around to the different homes in the area around Otavalo, the indigenous homes, they always were listening to Radio Iluman. So Radio Iluman is a force in that community. It has a lot of cultural enrichment projects. When this protest came up, it was very active in communicating information and mobilizing the community. So local indigenous radio has tremendous potential. I'm not aware of anything comparable to that in the Sibundoy Valley, but I know that that's a serious player in the Otavalo context.
So going back to the first part, the audience sort of thing, when they're doing those, the mingas on roads, are they blocking traffic? Are they interrupting the flow of traffic and commerce?
Yeah.
And how does that affect the broader system?
Yeah. So when they have 300 or 500 people walking on the road between Santiago all the way across to San Francisco, across the edge of the Sibundoy Valley, no traffic can move. And as you may know, in Latin America, stopping traffic is a way to actually bring down the government. In Ecuador, that's how you bring down the government. You simply close the Pan-American Highway, and sooner or later the government falls, right? So this is more isolated than that. But yeah, it brings everything to a stop, and it asserts a kind of an indigenous control over the moment. So that is definitely a feature of it. Yeah. Carlos.
So such a rich talk leaves me with many questions, most of which I'll leave to where sort of getting together on a regular basis and talking about some of these folklore ecology connections. But one question I might have, because I also want to turn it back so that graduate students and undergraduates can ask questions. I have one question. We have some ancestors in common. I mean, J.L. Austin is somebody I've been in deep dialogue with, for many, many years since I was a graduate student. But one thing we do in academic tradition is we rebel against our ancestors. So, I mean, what would you think about, so Austin gives you a powerful way of being able to think about what's going on in both of these places with regard to the sort of performativity of the sort of ecology, ecological performance. But what are some of the limitations? How do you need to change Jacobson and particularly here Austin to where in some sense they seem to be retooled in perhaps somewhat less